You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 126 for December 20th, 2017. I'm your host, Chris Webster, recording this intro on my iPhone because life happens. On today's show, we talk about life without a SHPO in your state, and what about CRM really is, and what it means. Nothing too serious. So, get out your pipes and whiskey, or your drink of choice, for this high-level conversation, because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Stephen in Calgary.
Hello.
And Doug in Scotland.
Hey, everyone.
All right, so today, first, before we get on to the show, I want to thank Stephen for doing an awesome job hosting episode 125. If you heard our last episode, he hosted episode 125, brought in a couple of guests. I mean, hit the ground running too, Stephen. You had six people total or something like that on the recording. It was a lot of tracks to manage and edit, but it was great, yes. And it seemed to go well though. No, it was a good episode, and it's not. I don't know. Managing that many people and keeping the conversation going is not as easy as our editing makes it sound sometimes, and making sure everybody's included and has a voice in the conversation and things like that. It can be a difficult process. It's a little easier when there's just the three of us, and we all know what we're doing. But when you bring in two guests and then you have our co-hosts and things like that, it gets to be a complicated thing. So it's not an easy task. All right. So
yeah. And this is kind of pulling the curtain aside a little bit. We're using new software as of a couple episodes a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
So like the second time I'd ever used it, and then on top of it, since it's kind of running through the browser. To go to the show notes, which is also in a different tab in my browser. I had to switch back and forth because I don't have multi-headed capabilities here at home. So there's a lot of like mashing my trackpad back and forth as quickly as possible to try to see stuff.
Nice. Yeah. And honestly, for anybody that's interested, we're using Zencastr, and that show, I mean, that wouldn't have been possible without Stephen having a bunch more software on his computer without Zencastr. So I appreciate that we were using that and we were able to do that because it enables us to record better and in a more easy, fluid fashion. If you're just recording everything on your home computer, there was a lot more steps that would have needed to have been involved. With Zencastr, it makes it all pretty easy, honestly, compared to the alternative. So, okay, we've got a few things we're going to talk about today, as I mentioned in the introduction, and these are born out of some Facebook discussions. And if you're on Facebook, please go check out the Archaeo Field Techs group, and it's ARCHAEO space field space techs, and then check out the North American Archaeological Tech Forum as well. There's a lot of really good conversations that happen in there, and I'd really like to combine the two because I honestly don't see the difference. But the biggest reason is I know a handful of people, and this happened with this conversation. They posted the same initial starting point, whether it was an article or just a call to action or whatever it is, in both groups, and then some people are in one group and some people are in another group, and the conversation kind of goes two different directions. But I mean, that's fine for those people in that group, but if you're trying to manage that conversation and follow it, like if you started it, it can get real confusing. Because I've done that before. I typically only post in Archaeo Field Techs, quite frankly, just because I want to keep it in one spot. So there's more members there. So go check that out. I moderate both groups. I'm not the only one. There's other moderators, but I moderate both of them. And if you're an archaeologist and you want to come in and have that conversation, then we'll let you right in. So, but they are closed groups, so you have to ask for entry. But anyway, one of the first discussions, and we're not going to get into the details on this necessarily because that's not what we want to talk about, but one of the discussions is about the Minnesota SHPO office moving from the Minnesota State Historical Society, which is a common place for SHPOs to be. I took a look at SHPOs across the country, and a lot of them are in Historical Society offices and buildings, and they're moving to the admin buildings, to the admin offices for the state. So there's basically concern over what's going to happen during that intermediate period? What about funding? What are they going to do while they're moving? Is all, SHPO review and stuff like that going to come to a halt for a little while? And what does that look like? But one of the conversations that took off from this was a little bit higher level discussion about, well, what if there is no SHPO? What if your state has no SHPO? What if your state decides to? I mean, this happened, almost happened in Nevada here one time. Is the SHPO was almost defunded basically. They didn't have their funding approved, and I just wanted to have that conversation with you guys. What is this talking about? What are we talking about with all this? What is the point of the SHPO? What does the SHPO do? And what happens if we don't have a SHPO? How does that default? But Stephen, I know you're a little bit more familiar with what's going on in Minnesota, and maybe you can just shed a little bit more light on enough of that situation so we can have this conversation and understand what we're talking about with SHPO.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm that much more familiar, because I think that we've been getting a lot of our information from the same posts. Yeah, generally, as I understand it, there was legislation put in place in Minnesota to move the SHPO from the Minnesota Historical Society to a different branch of the state government, the administration. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand from various back channel conversations is that there's not a lot of transparency in how exactly this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. Like do they have a plan? Do they do they know what they're doing, or is everything just going to are they just hoping that it'll just all turn out? Mm-hmm. And I think most of the concern is more a fact that people on the outside haven't heard anything, and are as we tend to do, we just automatically assume the worst and worry about it. And to be honest, any change is going to cause some turbulence, right? Mm-hmm. So things, it's pretty much guaranteed that as soon as the office moves, reviews are going to be a little shaky from at first, while they kind of sort through whatever their process is. That's assuming that they're just moving the duties. Mm-hmm. If they're actually moving people and the offices and all the existing infrastructure, there might not be any turbulence at all. I really don't know exactly what's moving, mm-hmm. and maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe nobody else does either. At this point.
Right. And so let's take that discussion, like we said, into a little bit higher level. What, let's talk a little bit, I guess, about what SHPOs do, so people know that, because we all think we know the answers to these questions sometimes, but when we really sit and think about it, do we actually know the answers to these questions, fully, or is it just, information we all think we know? So I've got some links in the show notes for this. A lot of stuff from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, some things from the, it's called NC SHPO, which is the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. They have their own website, and they have a lot of really good information. Actually, if you want to know who your SHPO is, or any state, you can go in and just click on they've got a nice interactive map, actually, that's actually really well done, that says, you just click on it and it shows you who the SHPO is for that state and who the deputies are, if there are any. Some states have, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 deputies. Some states have somebody who specifically does archaeology and somebody who specifically does, say, historic architecture or something like that. And then there's the overall SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Officer. And some states just have a SHPO listed, and I don't know if that means they have zero help and there's nobody else in that office, or if they're just not listed on the website. But some states just have literally one person and nobody else listed as their SHPO or deputies. So actually, I don't remember what Minnesota had as far as a listing goes, and maybe we can look at that real quick if the internet's going to work here. So yeah, let's take a look at Minnesota real fast and see how they're listed. So they list a Mr. Stephen Elliott as the SHPO, and it says Minnesota Historical Society right now still. And there's a deputy. So there's a single deputy, and it says that Amy Spong, is the Director of Heritage Preservation. So, and all this information is publicly available. Their phone numbers here, their address for the office, their email addresses. If you want to send them a message, you can do any of that. It's all publicly available information. So, okay, well, let's go over real quick what a SHPO does, because I don't think we've ever really had this conversation on the CRM Archaeology podcast. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of the things here. But SHPOs are federally mandated, and it's from the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And it says Section 101B here on the NC SHPO page, but as we'll mention later, the sections have actually changed. What you call them has changed because they changed the numbering on the regulation to fit other things. But anyway, it says every state and U.S. territory is a state historic preservation officer who, with the support of qualified staff, are charged with conducting comprehensive survey of historic properties, maintaining an inventory of historic properties, administering state programs of federal assistance, identifying and nominating eligible properties to the National Historic Register, advising and assisting federal, state, and local governments in matters of historic preservation, preparing and implementing a statewide historic preservation plan, providing public information, education, training, and technical assistance. That one's a little interesting to me. Anyway, working with local governments in the development of local historic preservation programs and help them become, quote, certified local governments, and then provide consultation for federal undertakings under the Section 106 provision of the National Historic Preservation Act. And one other thing I want to mention before we go too much farther is something that I don't think a lot of people know because of the way we talk about this. And I found this out, I think it was a year or two ago when I was looking this up. The Section 106 process, as we call it, comes from, literally paragraph Section 106, it's called, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. However, all the numbering changed to fit with the United States Code. So now it's technically 54, it's Title 54 of the United States Code, Section 306-108. And at the end of the National Historic Preservation Act, and this is linked in the show notes, there's a table that says what the former section designation was and now the current section designation. So you can find what you're looking for in the old system. If you're looking for Section 110, for example, it'll tell you what the new regulation is. Section 110 is now this, and Section 106 is now Section 306-108. And I was asking Stephen beforehand, I was like, when are we going to change that? Because there's books called the Section 106 process. There's Tom King's made a living on the Section 106 process and telling people about that. What, how long is it going to take before we call it something else?
I mean, it rolls off the tongue a lot better. It's easier to remember.
Than the Section 306-108 process?
Yes.
Yeah. Agreed. So I don't know. We'll probably end up coming up with a name for it.
Did 36 CFR 800 get changed? Because it might refer still to the 106 process.
It does, actually. And I was looking that up just this morning. It still calls things the 106 process. The ACHP website still calls everything the 106 process. It has I mean, that's not changed. But somebody that's just coming into this might be going, where are they getting Section 106? Why is this called Section 106? Because if you link to NHPA from the ACHP website, it goes to the new regulation. And you have to go all the way to the end to find out that this used to be called Section 106. It's not obvious.
36 CFR 800 is really, I mean, the actual Section 106 or the actual section formerly known as 106, which I think is what we should keep calling it. It is, doesn't really say, what we have to, I mean, they say what we have to do, but not how we have to do it. And 36 CFR 800 is really the nuts and bolts of what we do. So for later on in this discussion about, what do you do without a SHPO? I mean, that's laid out. That's already established in 36 CFR 800. So until they change it in that, I don't see us calling, stopping to call it Section 106, because 9 times out of 10, if you ever have to discuss the process with a lawyer, you're talking about the Code of Federal Regulations. You're not talking about the actual act.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you, man. Who knows what they're going to call it? Either way, let's talk about SHPO some more. Now that we've kind of laid the groundwork here in the last few minutes of this first segment, we're really going to get into it in the second segment, I'm sure. But in the last few minutes of this first segment, what is your understanding, guys? And I don't know, maybe Doug, you can go first since you haven't chimed in yet. What is your understanding of what would happen, just off the top of your head, if there weren't a SHPO for a little period of time, or for a long period of time, if a state decided not to provide funding for a SHPO, and there was a period of time where maybe there wasn't a SHPO, what is your understanding of what would happen?
A lawsuit. That's how it first started out with.
Right.
Essentially, because it's mandated by the law. So essentially, when any government organization does not follow the law, you essentially go to court, and then the courts enforce the government to follow the regulations, or they change them. I think in this case we're talking about individual states, and it wouldn't be a case of them rewriting the entire laws, making it redundant. Who would sue them? I'm not sure. Maybe it'd be some CRM companies, maybe someone like SHA. But at some point, someone's going to sue them and force them to do it. But and that assumes like the state's making the decision. If I don't know, something goes horribly wrong, funding doesn't come in, I actually can't really think of many times where you could really get away with not having a SHPO for a long period of time without changing the entire laws. You'd have to go back and rewrite it.
Yeah, I
think you could get away with it for a few months, maybe a year or two. It just depends on how long for the lawyers to sue. During that time, just because there's not someone called a SHPO doesn't mean there won't be someone doing SHPO-like work.
That's what I really mean too. Who's doing that work while there's no SHPO?
Yeah, because I guess when we're talking about SHPO, we should probably talk about like a SHPO separate from a SHPO office. Are we talking about the entire SHPO office being taken away? Because in a sense, there's all the time there's SHPOs who aren't in. Basically, when there's a turnover, someone quits or retires, or someone gets newly appointed, there'll be a period where there isn't actually a SHPO. But there'll be one of their deputies or someone else working in their SHPO office who will take over. So when you say, if there wasn't a SHPO, you mean like the SHPO office being completely taken out, right?
Yeah, that's what I would assume. If they were defunded, there wouldn't be anybody in the office, regardless of who's in the actual SHPO position. There's no office called SHPO, if they have no funding, if they shut their doors.
It depends what would happen in which state. So some states SHPO offices aren't within the state organization. So like, in New Mexico, it was definitely in the state. It's part of one of the Historic Preservation Division. But I believe in Colorado, it's the State Historical Society, which is a separate entity. And so you end up with, in different states, essentially nonprofits taking on the duties of the SHPO, being funded to do that. So I suspect if the funding went away in certain states, those organizations would still provide some sort of service, though it may be definitely reduced. In certain areas where there's states, if it was a state office and they got removed, it's hard to tell. Maybe it just gets pushed to some other different division and someone picks it up, or it might get more complicated because then you have TIPOs, and maybe one of the TIPOs stands in for a little while all the lawsuits are going through. But if you guys have different ideas of what would happen, that's how I'd see it go. Is there'd be a lawsuit, and depending on the state, there would be someone who would sort of pick it up and keep everything ticking over while the lawsuits go through.
Okay, well, we are going to pick this discussion back up on the other side of the break because we got a lot more to talk about on this. Before I do that, though, since I don't actually have an ad for it, I'll just mention arcpodnet.com/shop and holiday15 as the code to get 15% off almost everything in the store. The only thing we can't do is t-shirts because they come from another company. But the coffee mugs and stickers and actually podcast training and stuff like that is also included. Anything in the shop is subject to the holiday 15 code. And that code is valid until midnight, 11:59 p.m. Pacific time on December 31st. So even if you can't get it in time for Christmas, if you're listening to this on the day that it comes out, it's December 20th, I believe. You're probably not going to get a coffee mug by Christmas. I'll ship it as soon as I get the order, but you probably won't get the coffee mug by Christmas. However, you'll get it before the end of the new year, probably before the new year. All right, so we're going to break. Check out this message about our member program, and we'll be back shortly.
This network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our future online store, and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
All right, we are back with CRM Arc episode 126, and we're talking about life without a SHPO and what would happen. And Doug gave us his thoughts. Stephen, what are your thoughts on life without a SHPO if that were to happen?
Well, I think it would be a very different scenario than what Doug was kind of laying out. That kind of the opposite of, the people doing the job would still be there, but you wouldn't have a SHPO. I regard it more as the other way around, where you would have someone who's assigned this SHPO position, but you wouldn't have like there wouldn't be any funding or like the actual review and other duties would not necessarily be done. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, in 36 CFR 800, that's actually laid out. Like the SHPO does not have to participate. They can,
mm-hmm.
Just pass on it and leave it to the agencies to, make the determination. So, in my mind, and there's nothing a lawsuit could really do about that, unless something gets fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's sort of thing where, like an agency's like, yeah, we did our, good faith effort. But then there's a massive burial or, like cemetery that gets hit during the project, then, lawsuits plenty. And, it might come down to why wasn't there a SHPO involved to provide review. Otherwise, yeah, there's nothing really. There's nothing that you could really sue on because mm-hmm. a SHPO does not have to participate in review, and
right.
That can happen legitimately in certain ways. The programmatic agreement that I think is it Nevada, Utah, the BLM has.
Mm-hmm. I know Nevada has one.
Yeah, and so. Like the BLM can make the determination without immediate SHPO review and move ahead.
Mm-hmm.
That's typical, or if not typical, it's allowed for. Let's say it that way. The problem there is that the whole point of having a SHPO, in my mind anyway, is that the SHPO review is in some ways kind of like a peer review. It allows for another voice to review what's going on, and like if something's not, if something's not adequate, someone else can be like, well, I know you normally do good work, but this time, maybe you should have done something more, or this time, I can't necessarily agree with, your determinations because I think that you overlooked, this particular aspect of the properties you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
So the determination goes back to the federal agency, which there's still a certain amount of review aspect if you're dealing with like a permitted sort of driver. So like, if we're putting up, cell towers, for example, and it's a private company who's doing the project, but they have a permit, which, triggers the 106 process, or the process formerly known as 106. I think I still say we need to just keep calling it that. That theoretically or ideally the FCC, could do the review on their own to, add a certain level of, catchment, say. That they're doing their diligence by doing their own internal reviews. And so it's not just the archaeologist in the field who's making the call and whatever, we're just running with it. The problem, though, becomes like if it's actually a federal agency that's the proponent, right? So like if I'm working on, a military installation and, as the archaeologist, is like, yeah, this will be just fine. And there's no one there to be, like, no, you need that second opinion. Right. And I think that's where the robustness of, robustness, is that the word? Robustivity. But that's where, the diligence comes in for having a SHPO, like the SHPO review helps keep everything kind of on a level playing field and basically just, keeps the field guys honest. Like, cause sometimes it's really easy to overlook something or, misinterpret something, and having someone, just there as for error checking, I guess, is, I don't know. I think that's a good part of the process.
Yeah, so I assumed that they just defunded the position, got rid of it, not as in they appointed someone who just wouldn't follow through with the work.
Right.
Well, the problem is like if they're going to defund it, they're going to defund the office staff, because most of, a good portion of the actual position is funded by federal monies. So like the state's not going to defund, something they're not paying for.
Right.
And they are mandated to have it. And it's like, fine, we'll give it to Joe in corner office and run with that.
And maybe it would be some of the basic functions of SHPO, like, we go to SHPO. I mean, honestly, my only real physical interaction with SHPO here in Nevada, most of the time, is for site numbers. You get your state site numbers from SHPO, but otherwise, and I guess access to the site file system as well is also managed by SHPO, the NevCris we call it here, and that I get all through SHPO. But other than that, I don't have direct interaction with SHPO. I know there's stuff going on behind the scenes, and there's stuff happening with the reports that we're turning in, but honestly, not a whole lot other than getting entered into that site file system and them putting their stamp on it, because most of the projects I do are actually in conjunction with BLM. So
right, and so yeah. Because of the programmatic agreement,
right,
the BLM is taking the bulk of the review process.
Right, and that's relatively unique to Nevada. Not unique. I mean, there's other states that have that, but Nevada is. I mean, I hear different statistics, but it's at least 80% like federal land, BLM or Forest Service, something like that. So it's pretty heavily slanted that way. But a lot of states back east, especially, don't even have really a BLM or anything like that. I mean, it's all state or private land.
Well, they do. And I mean, I'm thinking the Midwest, so I'm not like too far east, but that there's Forest Service, there's national parks, there's there are a lot of federal agencies that manage land, not just the BLM, right? And there are BLM offices throughout the East, but the parcels of land are considerably smaller, obviously, and yeah, so. And any one of them can come up with, a programmatic agreement for, an alternative review process. As long as they're maintaining the core functions of 106, that they're actually considering the effect of their actions. You know, they can really, come up with a new plan of how they're going to do it. And in a lot of cases, those plans are designed to kind of offload or reduce the workload for both the SHPO and the agency, right? So you get, and part of it is like, it's a huge difference between like, okay, we're going to do this one utility corridor and like, okay, everything we do ever is an undertaking because we're the land managers. Like, and like the amount of undertakings is I don't know if exponentially is the correct word, but it's massively bigger than, other types of, the more permitted private land sort of undertakings. And so, and even then, like the FCC, I mean, they've got their whole programmatic agreement that was kind of off to a rocky start at first.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And there's other, as we mentioned, there's other functions of SHPO as well. And possibly if a state did some sort of defunding and wasn't matching, or adding their own funds to the funds that they're given by, by the federal appropriations that they're given, then maybe just some of the functions would go away. Like some of that list that we mentioned of, providing public education and doing some of those other things that are, helping set up the local certified governments and things like that. Maybe stuff like that would go away a little bit. Some of the slightly more non-essential features of the SHPO that aren't as immediate to really getting things done. Maybe that stuff would go away. I don't know. And then they would just do the base functions.
Or maybe those are more essential things. That if a SHPO does not have to actually participate in review, then but they are expected to give technical advice. I mean, what does that entail? Is that like, how technical does this advice have to be? Can it be just a bunch of documents on their website of like, here's what to do if you want to restore your historic building without losing its eligibility?
Right.
And I mean, like every SHPO has these things, right? And the necessary documentation for certified local governments and stuff like that. That might become the more important aspects because they're also part of the mandate. But there's no opt out for them.
Yeah, there's many ways you could cripple a SHPO office and still keep it around so that you could avoid any sort of lawsuits or anything like that. I mean, even just a list of sites. Now most SHPOs have it digitalized and, some sort of GIS format and you're able to access it and stuff like that. They don't have to do that. I mean, they could have a shoebox full of site reports and just say, have at it, figure out where the sites are now. If they wanted to. And they could, I mean, if you took away all the money, that they could eventually be forced to, get rid of the current systems they have to allow people to do site record checks. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different ways you could cripple any of the functions that any of the SHPOs currently do. Or you could pull sort of a Trump and appoint someone who's, like what do they have at the EPA, the guy who hates the EPA, and someone who could eventually just cripple and slow down the entire process or remove whatever functions that they do beyond what's mandated. And even if it is mandated, doing a review doesn't mean you have to do a review well. You can still run into problems where you do a review and you miss stuff, and that's just that's human nature with errors and stuff. But you could essentially cripple a SHPO if you wanted to, and just put in someone there who just said, nope, fine, don't need to do anything, it all looks great, and you could do a lot of damage if you really wanted to a SHPO office without actually getting rid of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think they'd have to decide what's important to what's most important. They'd have to prioritize if some sort of funding issue were to happen and they were to get rid of it entirely. Part of the problem here is we don't really understand, I guess, fundamentally from a state level. And I want to interview a SHPO and kind of get all these questions answered. But we don't really understand from a state level, like what their interaction is. What's their relationship with the federal government, the ACHP, from a funding standpoint, and with their state. Like if the state decided to not pony up their side of the funds anymore, what would that mean? How would that impact the SHPO? Would it mean they'd have to leave those offices and find somebody else to go? What would happen if that were to be the case? And if anybody knows or wants to come in and be on the show, then please do that. We are actually going to and Doug, you'll hold your comment till the end of the break. We're going to end this segment real quick so we can come back in segment 3 and wrap up this discussion about SHPOs. And then I want to ask another question as well regarding, quote, CRM Archaeology, just to make Tom King's ears bleed. So, all right, back in a second. Hey, podcast listeners. Do you find yourself wondering what the latest tablet or smartphone could do for your business? Wonder what GPS to pair with your device? Just trying to figure out how to go digital in the field without breaking the bank and or making a bad investment? Or did you find a technology company to work with but just aren't sure the questions you need to ask during the initial conversation? Well, you're not alone. There are literally thousands of tech combinations out there, and it can be really tough finding the right one for your business and your workflow. My name is Chris Webster, and I've been working in CRM since 2005, and I've been a tech enthusiast my entire life. I spend my time trying to figure out how to make archaeology more efficient both technologically and financially. No one is going to give you a big pile of money to do whatever you want with, so you have to make the most of what you have. The right gear can mean the difference between zero margins on that next project and an employee benefits package. That's where DigTech Concierge comes in. Let us be your technology guru. Whether you have just a few questions or want us on retainer 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, we're here to help. With years of experience, tens of thousands of acres of survey done completely digitally, and many, many people trained, DigTech is your tech BFF, just waiting to guide you through this process now and through the inevitable changes to come. Should you hold on to those tablets or upgrade? What about the new operating system? Will it crash your apps, or can you go ahead and do it? We know the answers and can guide you to a profitable year. Go to www.digtech-llc.com/tech-concierge to book a consultation or book us for the year. The yearly retainer includes unlimited calls and support and company training on software and gear. That's digtech-llc.com/tech-concierge. And concierge is CONCIERGE. To get going and go digital today. Call us before you make any decisions. We've been there before. Okay, we are back for the final segment of episode 126 of the CRM Archaeology podcast, talking about the SHPO and what they do in the process. So, Doug, you had a comment leading out of that last segment. Why don't you go ahead with that now?
Yeah, well, it's a bit to answer the question that you had, Chris. And I think the answer you'd find is there's almost 60 different answers to your question, because it's every state and every territory. And what is it, 59 different SHPOs?
59, yeah.
And I think there'd be some overlap, but I think you'd end up with 50 different answers, maybe high 40s, with very little overlap, because each state does it slightly different, with different organizations taking on the role of SHPO, different ways of running it, different methods. I'm not going to say that there's exactly 59 different ways of doing it, but I'm pretty sure we're close to that number. I mean, you guys have worked in different states and so forth. Have you not run into slightly different ways of doing things across different borders?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, just the simple fact that, when I've worked on the East Coast, the SHPO basically runs everything. They're who you talk to about stuff. But over here in Nevada, I have very little interaction with SHPO because it's mostly BLM that I talk to, BLM archaeologists. So I think that interaction between federal and state land and things like that is one aspect of how much a SHPO, interaction you have with them. But, other than that, I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm sure they have different ways of keeping their records and recording. I've encountered that, like when you have to do a record search in a state that has, SHPO offices, the way that they store their stuff and that you access it is a little different. Maybe the process for getting site numbers from them, what they require out of you for that. that can be a little different. I mean, essentially the processes are all basically the same, though. They might just slightly have a different process to it based on what they have technology wise. But they all have the same mandate. So they're all basically trying to do the same thing. The ACHP doesn't say, you guys could all do it differently. They all have the same goals in mind, I guess is what I'm saying, but they might come at it from a different direction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but in terms of like what we're talking about, funding and stuff like that, that could be a huge, quite variation across all the different states. Like they all have similar goals, but their methods, and especially how they get their funding, every state has a slightly different way of doing accounting, and how they divvy up money, and sometimes the money's ring fenced, sometimes it's discretionary spending. It just depends. So I think you'd end up with a lot of different answers.
Yeah, that's true. And who knows, depending on where the funding comes from in the state, what the political motivations are behind that as well. Depending on where that money is actually coming from, and how it's sourced, I guess. Anyway, any continuing thoughts on the SHPO issue?
I mean, we've mostly been talking about hypotheticals, so without any actual meat. I will say that in the Minnesota case, that's kind of sparked off our hypothetical discussion. That if I were working there, I think my attitude would be more of a, just keep marching the way you've always been marching and wait and see. There are going to be changes, obviously, because there are changes. But the level of effects of them are, undetermined at this point. And I don't see a lot of utility in hand-wringing over what may be.
Well, let's move on then. I have one more thing I want to talk to you guys about specifically, and we'll just see what you say about it. Every time we have a discussion on Facebook regarding something to do with archaeology, and somebody mentions archaeology or CRM archaeology in particular, on the Minnesota discussion, somebody mentioned, all archaeology is going to stop and blah, 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 and all this stuff. But anyway, Tom King, well-known author on the regulatory process, Tom King always steps in and says something to the effect of, why is this all about archaeology? It's not all about archaeology. And I try to say, it depends on your frame of reference on when we say CRM archaeology. I mean, for Christ's sake, this is the CRM Archaeology podcast, which Tom King was one of our first guests on this show. And he had a problem with it back then of us calling it the CRM Archaeology podcast because cultural resources management is not all about archaeology. There's no mandate to do archaeology in any of the federal regulations. There's a mandate to assess the effects of the undertaking on the properties, right? The historic properties. So sometimes that means archaeology. But I guess my point with this whole thing is I just want to say for the record that whenever I say CRM archaeology, I am usually specifically referring to the archaeological aspect of CRM, fully understanding that cultural resource management doesn't always mean archaeology. So do you guys have this issue? Do you think Tom King is just being a little bit nitpicky with this, or does he have a point? Should we refer to CRM in a broader sense rather than just archaeology, even amongst our peers and colleagues when we're talking on an archaeological forum about CRM archaeology? What do you guys think? Or am I just blowing this out of proportion?
Yeah. I think the answer to all of your questions are yes. Tom is Tom, and he I always referred to him as kind of lawyer-esque, which I can appreciate. That he's he tends to be or tries to be very precise in the terms that he uses. I think he's also correct that there's more to CRM than just archaeology. And conversely, I think it's also correct to say that there's more to archaeology than just CRM. And I feel that the CRM people, the CRM archaeologists, massive misnomer that it is, are doing large disservice by, to both sides of that argument. That, we're the ones who are like, well, we're the ones doing the field work. And it's like, yeah, but archaeology isn't just field work, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like there's a whole larger aspect to archaeology than just doing field work. Even within the CRM framework, there's, the field work is like the data collecting stage of, any research or, and I'm trying to think of good expression for the review process, but that's just the boots on the ground. Like, it's not the field work that determines whether something's eligible or not. I mean, it gives us data to make those determinations. It gives the data to, identify whether there are physical properties out there that ought to be, excavated, avoided, otherwise mitigated, capped, whatever it is. But I think that, because we're so fieldwork centric, that we tend to write off all of the other archaeologies that are out there.
Right.
And then conversely, because we are so, we tend to, keep the blinders on and focus, again, it's like, well, I don't care about historic structures or, other things. And I think that the way that we, perceive that, like, it's like, I don't, you get archaeologists like, I don't want to deal with other types of properties. And on the one hand, fair. I mean, we're not trained in that, right? It's like, trying to think about like, how many sashes a window has, or what exactly is a sash? And if it's just like the plastic strip that's like taped to the window, does that count as a sash, or is that all like architecture things? I don't know. I'm not an architecture. I'm not an architect or an architectural historian.
Right.
And I think I've mentioned this in the past, but I think we really ought to do a architectural history show for archaeologists. That would be a great episode idea. Part of that, I think, is the way that the process is set up, is that we kind of divorce out the various criteria for the National Register, or, like up here in Canada, it's a different process, but archaeology is somewhat divorced from structures and somewhat divorced from traditional properties. Or sacred sites. And I think that we need to start thinking more about, like the past from a holistic perspective. That we need to start, like the past is the past, and we all work in the past. So, we need to start coming up with better processes for, like how do we incorporate all of this? Do we start having an architectural historian on the field? Do we get more training for the archaeologists to identify important, extant structures? What do we do?
Well, let's get another opinion on this since we're running short on time here. Doug, what do you think about all this?
I agree with Stephen. I think unfortunately, archaeology, we basically got sort of somewhat defined 200 years ago when people started first using the term archaeology. I would think we should be more holistic in what we do, and I think archaeology is moving that way in general. It's a bit harder with CRM in that the laws were written, 40 years ago, and I think CRM archaeology is not the only type of archaeology we could do, and we should be more broad in what we do. And I think archaeology has changed a lot in the last 40 years, and how we should do CRM should change to reflect that. And I guess I'm more of a opinion of a lumper than a splitter, in that, all right, if Tom King has an issue with, archaeology not being CRM, I don't see anything wrong with archaeology moving towards being more holistic and being more about CRM, where it's not just about the artifacts in the ground, but you're also looking at, I mean, if you take historical archaeology as an example, that's a lot about looking at records and the historical and the archaeological record. You're looking at written records and the archaeological record. I like that holistic approach. But I also think Tom King has also talked about, well, how do you talk about religion and people's, views of a landscape? And I do think that should be something that archaeology tackles as well, and that we shouldn't be pinned down to just the people who dig in the dirt. And so I would hope that CRM archaeology becomes CRM in a sense, and that we definitely branch out more and look at more things that just aren't buried in our narrow little focus. But that's just my personal opinion. And so I guess we could quibble over, definitions, but I think it's more important to discuss what direction we want to be going in instead of, how we should define that as it currently is. But that's just my opinion.
Indeed. And those are all great opinions. I think personally that this all got wrapped up and we call it CRM archaeology. Well, for two reasons from my standpoint. One is archaeologists took up the mantle of handling, basically CRM as we know it, back in the 70s and 80s, once that, all these firms started getting built up as they came out of the university systems. And those projects, those development projects were done by archaeologists. So lumping that term CRM archaeology and everything we do, I mean, hell, half the companies in the country have archaeology in their title. So, they're not saying that we just do archaeology. I think they're just acknowledging who's doing the work and maybe not broadening out from the basic definition of archaeology, digging in the dirt and doing that science to, the entire process. I've thought about changing the name of this podcast from the CRM Archaeology Podcast. However, there's a fundamental problem with that in that CRM has multiple definitions in the world. It's mostly well known as customer resource management. The CRM, there's plenty of CRM programs out there that mean customer resource management for, dealing with that. There's also cockpit or crew resource management from flying. And if we just called it the CRM podcast or something like that, then we might get more listeners, actually, but we might get the wrong listeners.
Diversify the listener base. So,
right?
I totally count on the fact that every time I tweet something with a tag like CRM or something like that, I get a ton of customer resource management, followers, and it's like that's great. Here's an opportunity for them to learn about archaeology.
Yeah, indeed. I'm all for it. Anyway, that's what I think about it. We've come up as archaeologists, and to put one more point on this, which I mentioned to Tom in that post about the Minnesota SHPO, actually, he brought up, why is this archaeology? Why does that have anything to do with it? Why isn't it the broader term here? I basically just told him to kind of hopefully shut that down a little bit. Is you talk to your audience, and we're posting on the North American Archaeological Tech Forum, the Archeo Field Techs. When you're talking at the field tech level, they probably are archaeologists just doing archaeology. Field techs aren't generally doing more beyond that unless they're asked to do that, right? They're doing actual archaeology. They're surveying, they're digging. That's their life. That's what they're doing, right? So they are archaeologists doing archaeology, the archaeology part of CRM. So in that group, it's appropriate to say CRM archaeology. If I'm having a discussion on the CRM project managers group, maybe I don't call it CRM archaeology. Maybe I call it CRM or environmental compliance or something a little more broader term, if that's in fact what I'm talking about, because I'm talking to people who are involved with that part of the process. So I think it's totally appropriate to say CRM archaeology in those two particular groups, and in any situation where you're talking specifically to archaeologists about archaeological concerns. Now, that being said, the whole post was presented as a problem for archaeology, whereas if we lose the SHPO or the SHPO has a problem, that has broader implications than obviously just archaeology, as we've been discussing for the last hour. So anyway, I'm sure we'll get many opinions on this if people listen to this episode, and we post it in those archaeology groups. Just pointing that out, they get posted in Archeo Field Techs almost every time. Sometimes I'll post it in the other one as well, but usually Archeo Field Techs will post this. So send us your thoughts and questions and concerns on this. I want to know what people think would really happen in a SHPO-less world, to go back to the first topic. And do you think, what do you think about the term CRM archaeology? We always hear Tom's opinions on it, but I want to hear everyone else's opinions on it. What do you think about this? What should we do going forward for the image of our field and what people think about us when we say CRM archaeology? Or should we come up with something else? We can't just say CRM. I fully believe that. There's too confusing in the broader sense of the internet and the world. CRM has other meanings, even though we were probably here first from that standpoint. Well, actually, aviation was probably there first from cockpit or crew resource management. That's been a term for a really long time. And then I would be willing to bet cultural resource management would be the next one. And then customer resource management has become huge in the age of the internet and the programs that help manage that. So anyway, that's about all we have for today. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back next time. This, if I'm not mistaken, is the last episode. Yeah, actually, looking at my calendar, this is the last episode for 2017. The next episode will come out right in the beginning of January for 2018. So thanks to everybody who listened to all our episodes in 2017, and I'm sure we'll have more great content on the CRM Archaeology podcast for 2018. And we promise not to just talk about archaeology. We'll broaden our scope a little bit like we did with this one. So all right, thanks everybody. And one last thing, of course, as we move into 2018, I'm still got to call out for keeping the co-host pool fresh and entertaining. Not that you guys are stale and non-entertaining. I'm just kidding. But I'm always looking for other people to come in and co-host this show so we can bring in new opinions and perspectives. So if you're interested in doing that, even on an occasional basis, let me know, Chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com, and we'll do it. Thanks a lot. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.arcpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye.
He's even muted his microphone, and he's counting down. I'm just doing this for our listeners, counting down in our chat. Doug is to his eventual goodbye. 2, what is this, the New Year's?
Goodbye, everyone.
Jesus, that was something special there. This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.